A poor hotel cleaner was a victim of humiliation, but a rich guest stood up for her and then changed her life. A luxurious hotel on the edge of a bustling metropolis. Marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, soft music in the lobby, it all seemed like another world to those who worked here. Laura stood by her cleaning supplies cart, feeling like a small shadow in this glittering palace. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, but clean. Her hair was tucked into a modest ponytail, her face tired but still young. She had just finished cleaning one of the rooms where a young couple had left a mountain of dirty dishes, wet towels, and caustic comments directed at her. "Do I have to apologize again for existing?" she thought, rolling the cart to the next door. Laura had always tried to keep a low profile, but life at the hotel was unpredictable. Every day was a new guest, a new challenge. This time the challenge was particularly humiliating. Opening the door to one of the suites, she heard a loud voice. "Who cleans like this anyway? There's dust in the corner and the bathroom smells like someone slept here." Inside was a couple. A man in an expensive suit and a woman with bright makeup and high heels. They were clearly enjoying their power over the staff. "I'm sorry, I'll fix it," Laura said quietly, lowering her eyes. "Fix it? You can't even do that properly," snapped at the woman. The man laughed. "Look, she's also blushing. Maybe she should work in a country hotel." Laura clutched the rag in her hand, but remained silent. She knew any words would only make the situation worse. Suddenly a voice from the back of the room cut short the humiliation. "I think that's enough," said the man who had previously been standing at the window, watching the city. He stepped out of the shadows, his tall stature and confident movements silencing the room. "Who are you to interfere?" the woman burst out. "One who does not tolerate injustice," he replied calmly, casting Laura a look full of sympathy. It was Alexander. His calm tone and cold gaze made the rude guest look confused. "Apologize to her," he added. "What?" The woman was indignant. "Or I'll get the manager and your room will go to someone more deserving." Laura froze. No one had ever taken her side. She felt tears come to her eyes, but held them back as best she could. The couple reluctantly apologized and, snorting, left. Alexander turned to Laura. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, thank you," she replied quietly, still stunned. "Don't let people like that humiliate you," he said, and then walked away, leaving her alone in a room full of contrasts, humiliation and unexpected support. That would have been the end of the story, but that moment was the beginning of a change Laura could not have imagined. After that incident, Laura went back to her daily duties, but something was different inside. She couldn't get the man who had stood up for her out of her mind. It was a strange feeling, gratitude mixed with bewilderment. Why had he intervened? Who was he? Laura was not used to kindness. Her life had been a chain of constant trials that left little room for faith in the best. She was born in a small town where work and money were rare. Her father left the family when she was 5, leaving her mother, Laura, and her younger brother Sam to fend for themselves. "We'll manage," her mother said, but coping became increasingly difficult. When Laura turned 16, her mother became ill. Hospitals, bills, debts, all of it fell on the girl's shoulders, who was forced to drop out of school and go to work. First it was a job at a local diner, then a cleaning lady at a local office. Laura always took on anything that could help feed her family. A few years ago, as her mother got better, Laura decided to try moving to a city where there was a better chance of a job. She found a place in a small rented accommodation and got a job in a hotel as a cleaner. The work was hard but stable. Her day started at dawn and ended late at night. Laura cleaned dozens of rooms, washed linens, tolerated the rudeness of guests. Her colleagues were indifferent to her. She was not part of their circle. They laughed and gossiped while she silently did her work. "Laura, are you here tonight again?" one of the maids would sometimes ask. "Yes. Someone has to," she answered with a tired smile. The money she earned went to pay her rent, medicine for her mother, and her brother's education. Sam was her pride. He had managed to get into college, and she did everything she could to make sure he could study. But Laura rarely thought of herself. Her dreams seemed unattainable. "Maybe one day I can go to the countryside and open a little cafe," she sometimes fantasized before bed. But reality quickly brought her back down to earth. The incident with the rude guests was not the first time in her life. Laura was used to being humiliated, but that day was different. That man, Alexander, had surprised her. She didn't know what to think. People of his level usually didn't notice people like her. Why did he do that? She thought as she drifted off to sleep in her small room. That question swirled around in her head until she fell asleep. The next morning began as usual for Laura, warm tea in the kitchen of her small room, an old radio quietly playing 90s tunes. She glanced at the pictures of her mother and brother on the shelf as a reminder of what she was putting up with all this for. At work, everything was predictable. The usual mountains of dirty laundry, trash, dust. No one said thank you, no one noticed her presence. But when she walked into the lobby to pick up her inventory, her heart sank. There he was. Alexander stood at the front desk, checking something with the receptionist. His voice sounded calm but confident, and his presence seemed to fill the entire room. Laura looked away, afraid he would recognize her. She wasn't used to anyone paying attention to her, much less a man like this. Laura had run into him several times throughout the day. She was sweeping the hallway when he stepped out of the elevator. He gave her a brief nod and she hastily averted her eyes. "Why am I so nervous?" she thought as she continued her work. In the evening, when most of the guests had gone to dinner, Laura was given the task of cleaning one of the halls. It was a standard job: check for cleanliness, arrange the furniture, dust. But when she entered the hall, she was again in for a surprise. Alexander was sitting at one of the tables, talking on the phone. His voice was low, businesslike, but with a hint of softness. He noticed Laura as she began to clear a neighboring table. "Excuse me, am I disturbing you?" she asked quietly. "No, of course not," he replied, putting his phone away. Laura continued her work, trying not to look in his direction, but she could feel his gaze. "You're working late again," he said suddenly. Laura froze. "Yeah, I always have shifts like that," she replied without looking up. "You have a tough job." "Well, someone has to do her," she tried to smile, but her voice sounded tired. Alexander was silent for a moment, as if considering whether to continue the conversation. "Have you worked here long?" "About 2 years," Laura said, still avoiding looking at him. "And are you satisfied?" Her smile disappeared. She turned to him, looking directly into his eyes for the first time. "I do what I can. It's not a matter of contentment, but of necessity." His face changed. A shadow of understanding appeared in his eyes. That's an honest answer, he said, smiling slightly. This short conversation was something new to Laura. She wasn't often asked questions about her life, much less by people like Alexander. As she finished cleaning up and was about to leave, he called out to her. "Wait," he said, pulling his wallet out of his pocket. He placed several large bills on the table. "These are for you. And please don't refuse." Laura blushed. "I can't accept it," she whispered. "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's a thank you for your work." She hesitated, but eventually took the money, thanking him. The encounter left her with mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was grateful for his kindness. On the other, she couldn't understand why he had paid attention to her in the first place. Maybe it's just a coincidence, she thought as she fell asleep in her small room. But in the back of her mind, she knew something had changed. The next day, Laura noticed that her coworkers were whispering behind her back. Several of them grinned enviously, glancing in her direction. "Look at that, she seems to have found a sponsor," one of the maids said, not hiding her sarcasm. Laura tried to ignore it, but the words still hurt her. She understood that the rumors had spread because of Alexander's generous tips, which one of the staff had noticed. By noon, as Laura was cleaning the mirrors in the lobby, a familiar voice called out to her again. "Do you always work this hard?" She turned around and saw Alexander standing near the counter holding a coffee. "It's my job," she replied briefly, smiling slightly. "Can I ask you a question?" he asked, taking a step closer. She nodded, though there was a slight hint of wariness in her eyes. "Why do you put up with this? Those humiliations, that work that no one notices?" The question caught her off guard. She even stopped breathing for a moment. "Because I have no other choice," she answered honestly. Her voice sounded calm, but there was bitterness behind it. "I'm supporting my family. My mom is sick and my brother is in school. I'm doing what I have to do." Alexander listened intently, his gaze focused, but there was no pity or judgment in it. "You are stronger than many of those who dress in expensive suits," he said after a short pause. Laura smiled slightly, but said nothing in response. "Tell me, do you have a dream?" Her face changed. The question was unexpected and too personal. "I don't think about dreams," she answered quietly. "Why?" "Because they rarely come true." Alexander said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her face, as if he were trying to figure out what was behind her words. That conversation stayed in Laura's mind. It seemed strange to her that a man like Alexander could be interested in her life. Nevertheless, he kept showing up. Sometimes they exchanged a few phrases, sometimes he just smiled as he passed by. She began to notice something more than just wealth in him. There was a depth in his demeanor, in his words, that was rarely found among hotel guests. A few days later he spoke to her again. "Have you ever thought about changing your life?" he asked as she cleared tables in the hotel cafe. "Of course I've thought about it. But it's not that easy," she replied. "Why don't you give it a try?" "And what am I supposed to do? Quit my job and expect things to change on their own?" Her voice sounded a little harsher than she intended, but he didn't take offense. "Sometimes change requires risk," he said. That evening, driving home, Laura thought about his words for a long time. He had talked about change, but she couldn't understand why he was so interested in her fate. "Maybe he just feels sorry for me," she thought as she went to bed. "Tell me, do you have a dream?" Her face changed. The question was unexpected and too personal. I don't think about dreams, she answered quietly. Why? Because they rarely come true. Alexander said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her face, as if he were trying to figure out what was behind her words. That conversation stayed in Laura's mind. It seemed strange to her that a man like Alexander could be interested in her life. Nevertheless, he kept showing up. Sometimes they exchanged a few phrases, sometimes he just smiled as he passed by. She began to notice something more than just wealth in him. There was a depth in his demeanor, in his words, that was rarely found among hotel guests. A few days later he spoke to her again. Have you ever thought about changing your life? He asked as she cleared tables in the hotel cafe. Of course I've thought about it. But it's not that easy, she replied. Why don't you give it a try? And what am I supposed to do? Quit my job and expect things to change on their own? Her voice sounded a little harsher than she intended, but he didn't take offense. Sometimes change requires risk, he said. That evening, driving home, Laura thought about his words for a long time. He had talked about change, but she couldn't understand why he was so interested in her fate. Maybe he just feels sorry for me, she thought as she went to bed. You've already proven that you know how to work. You're serious, responsible, and frankly, you deserve more, he began. Her eyes widened. I want to offer you a job in my company. Those words seemed to hang in the air. Laura stared at him, trying to figure out if he was joking. A job? At your company? But Don't doubt yourself, he interrupted. I've seen you handle difficult tasks. You're much smarter than you think. Laura was confused. But what can I do in your company? I didn't go to university, I have no qualifications. That's not a problem. You'll get training. I'm sure you'll do well. She stared at him, feeling hope and fear mingle in her chest. Why do you want to help me? Alexander thought for a moment. Perhaps because someone helped me once myself when I was in a difficult situation, he said. Those words touched her. She had always thought that people of his level didn't know the struggle of life. But the doubts remained. I can't just leave everything behind. I have a family, a mother, a brother. They depend on me. I understand, he said. Think about it. It's not an immediate decision, but I'm sure you deserve better. He stood up and, before he left, added. Sometimes the best way to help your loved ones is to help yourself first. Laura tossed and turned in bed all night, pondering his words. It was a chance she had never dreamed of, but the fear of the unknown kept her awake. She felt she was at a crossroads. Laura woke up with a heavy weight on her soul. She still didn't know what to do. Alexander's offer was like a dream, but a dream that scared her to the point of shivering. I could never work for a company like that. It's too much for me, she told herself as she got ready for work. But the thought of changing her life for her family never left her. The next day, walking past the lobby counter, Laura saw Alexander. He noticed her and, as if knowing she was hesitating, stepped closer. Have you thought about my proposal? He asked. Yes, but I'm afraid I won't be able to do it, she answered honestly. Everyone is afraid of change, Laura. But fear is no reason to stay where you are. Give yourself a chance. His words sounded confident, and Laura felt something shift inside. Okay. I'll try, she finally said, though her voice trembled. Alexander smiled. It will be the start of something new. I'm sure. A week later, Laura crossed the threshold of Alexander's office for the first time. The spacious lobby with marble floors, the austere but stylish furniture, the staff in expensive suits, it all seemed like a foreign world to her. "Welcome," the young woman at reception said, ushering her to Alexander's office. He greeted her warmly and introduced her to the team. "This is Laura. She'll start as assistant manager. I'm sure she'll settle in quickly." Some of the staff smiled at her, but in their looks Laura saw bewilderment. "Assistant manager? That girl?" She heard a whisper behind her back. The first time was hard. Her new world was filled with difficult tasks, cold stares, and constant tension. Colleagues, especially those who had been with the company for a long time, didn't hide their contempt. "She's a hotel cleaner and now she wants to become one of us?" sarcastically said someone in the smoking room. Laura heard these words, but tried not to show that they hurt her. However, there were some nice moments. Alexander personally coached her, showing her how to solve problems, schedule meetings, and handle pressure. "You're learning faster than I thought you would," he once said. "Thank you." "I'm trying," she replied, smiling. Laura felt herself slowly starting to get used to the new rhythm. Her days were long, but she relished the opportunity to learn something new. However, one day there was an incident that shook her confidence again. During an important presentation, a coworker had pointed out her mistake in the paperwork on purpose, trying to make her look bad. "Well, that's not surprising given her experience," he remarked wryly. Laura felt paint flood her cheeks, but Alexander was quick to intervene. "Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them," he said firmly, giving the employee a look full of warning. That moment was a turning point for Laura. She realized she had to be stronger. As she drove home that evening, she reflected on how her life had changed in a few weeks. Fear of change began to give way to pride in herself. "Maybe I really do deserve more," she whispered, looking out the bus window. After a few months, Laura began to feel more confident in her new role. She had mastered basic skills, learning how to manage spreadsheets, schedule meetings and communicate with clients. Alexander continued to monitor her progress, occasionally offering advice but generally giving her autonomy. But deep down, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was still a stranger in this new world. One day, after a difficult day, Alexander unexpectedly invited her to dinner. "You deserve some rest," he said with a slight smile as they stood in his office. "Dinner?" she wondered. "It's not a business proposition. Just a way of saying thank you for your work." Laura hesitated at first, but his confidence and friendliness broke her doubts. The dinner was held in a cozy restaurant where Alexander often invited his partners. The atmosphere was warm, the lighting soft, and the waiters served as if they knew each guest personally. "You're a very fast learner," Alexander said as they sat down at the table. "Thank you. But I still have a lot to learn." "That's normal. No one becomes a professional overnight." He looked at her, and there was something more than professional interest in his eyes. "Can I ask you a question?" she said suddenly. "Sure. Why are you helping me? You could have chosen someone with experience, someone who already knows how to work in your company." Alexander thought for a moment before answering. "Perhaps because I see myself in you," he began. "Myself? I grew up in a poor family. I had no connections, no money, no chance. But one day someone believed in me and gave me a chance. And I decided that if I got the chance, would do the same for someone else. Laura was silent, mulling over his words. You are not only talented, but tenacious. It's a rare combination, he added. That conversation changed a lot of things in their relationship. Laura began to see in Alexander not only a successful businessman, but also a man who had gone through hardships himself. But along with that, she began to feel something more emerging between them. His eyes began to linger on her longer, his voice sounded softer when he spoke to her. One evening, when they were late for work, he confessed out of the blue. Do you know you're special, Laura? Her heart sank. Alexander, I'm not sure you're right. I'm rarely wrong, he said with a smile. She didn't know how to respond. Her feelings were mixed, gratitude, respect, but also fear. She was afraid it might ruin what she had already built. Thank you for your words. But I think we'd better get back to work, she said quietly, breaking the moment. Alexander took her hint and didn't bring it up again. But deep down, Laura felt that their relationship had become too complicated. As the weeks passed, Laura continued to work at the top of her game. She no longer paid attention to her co-workers' whispers, was no longer afraid of challenging tasks, and even sometimes felt confident in this new world. But the feeling of uncertainty in her relationship with Alexander did not give her peace. He still treated her with respect, but their conversations became increasingly personal. One evening, after a long day at work, he offered her a ride home. I'd like to talk to you, he said as they got into his car. The drive was quiet, the night city twinkling outside the windows. Laura felt her heart clench in anticipation. Alexander, if this is about work. It's not about work, he interrupted. He was silent for a moment, then continued. Laura, I think you know I have a thing for you. These words came out so quietly, yet so loudly at the same time, that she didn't immediately find something to say in response. I appreciate everything you've done for me. But I'm not sure it's the right thing to do. Why? He asked softly, turning to her. Because I'm afraid of losing what I already have. I'm afraid it might ruin everything you've done for me. Alexander looked at her with understanding. You're right. It is a risk. But sometimes it's worth the risk for what's important. Laura averted her gaze. She couldn't deny that his attention flattered her, that she felt something more than gratitude for him. But the fear of change, of possible disappointment, was too great. I need time, she said at last. Okay, he replied, not insisting. The next few days were difficult. Laura tried to focus on work, avoiding personal conversations with Alexander. But one day she received a letter left on her desk. Laura, I understand that you don't want to rush things. But remember, you are worthy of more than you think. If you ever need help or support, I'll always be there for you. Those words touched her. She felt that their relationship had reached the point where a decision had to be made. At the end of the week, Laura came to see Alexander. I'd like to talk, she said, walking into his office. He looked up, waiting to see what she would say. I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You've opened the door to a new world for me, given me a chance I never even dreamed of. But I think I need to move on by myself. Why? He asked softly, turning to her. Because I'm afraid of losing what I already have. I'm afraid it might ruin everything you've done for me. Alexander looked at her with understanding. You're right. It is a risk. But sometimes it's worth the risk for what's important. Laura averted her gaze. She couldn't deny that his attention flattered her, that she felt something more than gratitude for him. But the fear of change, of possible disappointment, was too great. "I need time," she said at last. "Okay," he replied, not insisting. The next few days were difficult. Laura tried to focus on work, avoiding personal conversations with Alexander. But one day she received a letter left on her desk. "Laura, I understand that you don't want to rush things. But remember, you are worthy of more than you think. If you ever need help or support, I'll always be there for you." Those words touched her. She felt that their relationship had reached the point where a decision had to be made. At the end of the week, Laura came to see Alexander. "I'd like to talk," she said, walking into his office. He looked up, waiting to see what she would say. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You've opened the door to a new world for me, given me a chance I never even dreamed of. But I think I need to move on by myself."